We're now going to take a look at the main.xml layout for the Favorite Twitter Searches app. Now, in this particular app, we once again chose to use a table layout, which we introduced in the previous lesson. And in this lesson, we'll focus on just the new features in this graphical user interface rather than going through all the steps of building the table layout once again. Now, as you can see here, we have 5 rows and 2 columns, and with the exception of row number 1, each of the other rows has only one element in it that spans both columns. In row number 1, we have an edit text and a button in column 0 and column 1 respectively. Now, because only one of the rows in this example has multiple elements, we could have used other layouts to build this same GUI. For example, we could have used a linear layout that's oriented vertically to do all of what are currently labeled as rows in this diagram. And for what is labeled as row number 1 here, we could have used a nested linear layout that's oriented horizontally to represent the edit text and the save button. So there is a lot of flexibility in using the different layouts that are provided to you by Android. Now, what I want to focus on as we take a look at the main.xml file here is what's new in this layout. And remember, when you first load up main.xml, if you've got Android 3 installed as one of the platforms, usually that's going to come up first. In my case, I also have Android 3.1 installed. I'm going to use the 2.3.3 designer, and I'm going to go ahead and select 3.7-inch WVGA, since that's what I used originally to design this particular graphical user interface. Now remember, you can also display your outline view here. Oops. There we go. To show you the table layout with all of its rows and all of the different elements. You can see the structure, if you will, of the table layout very nicely here in the outline view. And remember, as you select any given element, it's going to highlight that over here in the outline. Now, let's go ahead and take a look at the XML representation of this so we can show you what's new. And first of all, we have our table layout. Remember, what we did in the previous app to create the table layout for main.xml is to delete the original main.xml that was provided when we created the app and replace it with a new file that uses table layout as its root element. Now, in this table layout, there's a couple of new things here on line 5. For the stretch columns attribute, which we did introduce in the previous lesson, here instead of specifying the particular columns that should stretch, we're using asterisk to indicate that all of the columns should stretch. And separately for the background, where instead of hard coding and a color, in hexadecimal format, we're using one of the predefined Android colors. And notice the syntax here, Android :color/white. You can see what those predefined colors are in the online documentation for Android in the r.color class. And you can see that there's a number of constants here that represent the different predefined colors, and you can use all of these names, such as white in my case, to indicate what the background color should be for the layout. Now, going back over to our XML, the next new feature that we have is in table row 0 here. And we have an edit text, and within that edit text, we showed you previously that you can specify the input type for the edit text, which is going to determine which keyboard gets displayed when the user touches that edit text, or if it's a device that has a built-in keyboard, it's going to help restrict what the user can type into that particular edit text. In this case, it's called the query edit text. And one of the new features here is the hint option, or the hint attribute. With the hint attribute, you can specify a hard-coded string or a string resource, as we did here, and that text gets displayed in gray by default in the background, if you will, of that input or that edit text element. That way, it gives the user a hint as to what the purpose of that edit text is, and that hint text goes away once the user starts typing in the element. The other new feature that we have here is the Android IME options attribute, and we've specified here action next. Now, let me go over to the AVD for a moment to show you what that means. Basically, when I type in this text box here, what's going to happen is the keyboard is going to be displayed, or as I click in it, and you'll notice that the button in the bottom right corner of the keyboard here is next. So if I now use this keyboard to enter a search, so let's just go ahead and do that through the keyboard on the screen here. I'll say we're going to do a search for Ditel. Now if I hit the next button, watch what happens at the top of the AVD. Now the next element, the tag edit text, gets the focus so that the user can immediately start typing again in that edit text. So by specifying the IME option action next, it went ahead and allowed me to jump from the edit text where I was typing directly to the next edit text where the user should then tag the query. Now if I then tag my query, again let's say I tag it, I'll just say Ditel again here for demonstration purposes. Now if I hit the done button, what that does is dismiss the keyboard, and now I can hit save to save my tagged query. So as you'll see in a moment, the other edit text uses the IME option action done to display a done button on that keyboard. So by taking advantage of these IME options, you can automatically have the focus transfer from one field to the next in your graphical user interface. So scrolling down a bit here to row number 1, you can see our other edit text, and for this edit text we've given a hint string, which is the tag prompt string, and again you can see these string resources in the strings.xml file. And the input type on this one is text, which of course determines which type of keyboard gets displayed. Over here you can see the IME options set to action done, which is why the done button was displayed on that keyboard, and when the user touches the done button, automatically the keyboard is dismissed from the screen if it's a soft keyboard. We also have our button here, which is going to be touched by the user to save the tagged query. Now in table row number 2, you can see here for the background that we're specifying a color that we've defined in the colors.xml file. So this is a color resource called light orange, and again by defining that color as a resource we can change that color without having to change the source code of our application. We can just go directly into the colors.xml file and reset that color to be a different hexadecimal value, and in that case the new color will be applied automatically to any elements that use this color resource. And by the way, it's not really necessary to have separate XML files for all the resources. If you look, for example, in strings.xml, you'll see that you have a resources element with a bunch of string elements in it. If you look in dimen.xml, you have a resources element with a bunch of dimension elements in it. And if you look in colors.xml, you have a resources element with a color resource in it. The thing that's important is that they're all resources. You could actually define the contents of each of these resources elements in a single XML file, and as long as they're named correctly, in this case color, or if I go back here, in this case dimen, or if I go back to the strings XML, in this case string, the IDE is automatically going to know to create the appropriate resources for you in the gen folder. And the gen folder, if you expand this out, has this file called r.java, and when I double click that, you can see that it's creating a bunch of classes here. Here's my color class with my light orange resource. Here's my dimen class with the different dimension resources I defined. If I scroll down, here are all the different GUI elements we defined in the ID class. Here's the string class with all the different string resources that we defined as well. And you can see these are all integer constants that represent the different resources. So the key is not having separate XML files for the different values that we're defining. The reason we do that is just for clarity, we separate out the different types of resources, but in reality all of the resources can be defined in a single resource file within the resources element if you want. So going back from that aside now to our code. So again, we are using the color resource to define the background color for this particular row as light orange, and you can see down here in table row 3 as well that we also set the background color for that row to light orange as well. So if I go back over to the graphical representation here, this big orange box actually consists of 2 rows the first row has an orange background color and the next row has an orange background color as well. And that background color is separate from the background for the entire GUI, which as you can see is white around all of the different elements. All right, so going back over to our layout now as well, we've set for this text view the text color to be black because the default is a lighter gray color that doesn't stand out as well. Notice for this text view in table row 2 that we've also set its text size to 18sp to make it a bit bigger than the default. Scrolling down now to table row 3 to take a look at what's new there. Within this table row, you'll notice a couple of things. First of all, you'll notice that this is the only row where we specified the layout weight. And we set its layout weight to 1. And basically what that allows us to do, regardless of the size of the actual screen on which we display this app, the scroll view that shows up in this table row here is going to take up basically all the remaining space that's not occupied by row 0, row 1, row 2, and row 4. So that way we can allow this area to expand to allow us to have as many possible tag buttons and edit buttons as we can see. And remember, this is a scrollable area, so if we can't see all of the buttons, the user can still scroll through that area to see the buttons and touch the appropriate one. So going back over to our code, again, we've set the layout to 1 for that particular row and only that row. Also, we have our first time a scroll view here, and of course we dragged that out of our set of widgets that's available here and placed it into table row 3. So for the scroll view, like any other element, we give it an ID. We specified its layout width to match parent, and the span to 2 because it's going to span both columns. The padding on this element is 5 dp, which just means all of the things stored inside of this scroll view will have that 5 pixel or 5 density independent pixel spacing around it. Within the scroll view, we placed an empty table layout, and we're going to be adding rows to that table layout that represent all the different tag buttons and their corresponding edit buttons. You can see that the table layout is set to match the size of its parent, which is the scroll view. Again, we use the padding attribute to provide some spacing within the layout, and we set the stretch columns to asterisk here so that all of the things we place into that table layout row by row will have the columns stretched to fill the entire width of that table. Now in table row 4, down at the bottom here, we have our button, and that button is going to be used to clear out the entire set of queries that we've saved previously. So that's the main layout. In the next video, we're going to take a look at another layout called New Tag View, which we're going to be inflating dynamically to create the query buttons that are displayed inside of this table layout within the scroll view.